Hi guys, welcome back to Lost in My Library. My name is Kate. Today I am doing the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. This was originally a romance tag, I do believe, by followingforromance.com. And then I think people just changed it to fantasy. So, yeah. I'm excited. Fantasy is one of my favorite genres to read, along with mystery and thrillers. But I love fantasy. Love fantasy a lot. So let's just this is just a tag to get to know me, I guess. So number one is, what is your fantasy origin stories? Basically, how you came to read your first fantasy novel. I think my first fantasy novel, when I really think about it, was, I think it was the Chronicles of Narnia. Either the Chronicles of Narnia or Harry Potter. I know, great first fantasy novels to actually get into. I remember vividly I got the 7-book bind up of the Chronicles of Narnia as a Christmas present one year when Prince Caspian was coming out. I know I still own that book, by the way. I still own that bind up. If you've seen me hold it up, it's the one that has the red duct tape on the spine because it's literally falling apart. It started reading that because I think I watched the first movie and wanted to read the book subsequently after that. And then my Harry Potter, I started reading because of the Accelerated Reader program, and I wanted to eat pizza. I have a whole video about this. My story about why I read Harry Potter out of order. It's a funny video. You should go check it out because my story with reading Harry Potter is really funny. I read Harry Potter out of order so I could have pizza. Yep, that's my story. It's really great. Number 2, if you could be the hero/heroine in a fantasy novel, who would be the author, and what's one trope you'd insist be in the story? I think the only person I don't know that I trust would be Rick Riordan. I trust Rick Riordan we trust in Uncle Rick, we trust, all of that. I really love Rick Riordan. What's one trope that I'd wish I'd insist be in there? I could have anything. I'm thinking back of what Rick Riordan does best. And I think what Rick Riordan does best is I think his romance parents are just top notch. He does great with them. But making the villains feel like there's certain villains that I just feel for, and he does good job of making you hate people that are supposed to be good. But I think back to Percy Jackson, and I just think of how much he made me feel for Luke. So maybe an anti-hero. I do like a good anti-hero storyline. So maybe I'd like an anti-hero being in there. Number 3, what is a fantasy you've read this year that you want more people to read? I mean, I always push for Rick Riordan. I've read a lot of Rick Riordan in the last year. I always push to read more Rick Riordan. I think because I read the Kane Chronicles. I think I finished the Kane Chronicles even in January. So I read the Kane Chronicles at the end of December and beginning of January. I think everybody should read the Kane Chronicles because they're amazing. They're so underrated. And there's going to be a Netflix adaptation. And just, like, you should read them. You should read Kane Chronicles. And I feel like Kane Chronicles gets overlooked all the time when talking about Rick Riordan books. And I just need people to see the craziness that love triangle between Sadie, Anubis, and Walt ends up being, because, like, what? Okay. Sure. Fine. What? I'm still confused by how that ended. Number 4, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, and what subgenre have you not read much from? I can tell you straight off the bat, I don't read a lot of fantasy romance. Books that are marketed as fantasy romance, because it seems like a lot of books that are technically fantasy and don't get classified as fantasy romance, their second highest genre listing on Goodreads is romance. I find that very interesting. But I don't read a lot of fantasy romance, because it tends to be heavy on the romance and not so much the fantasy part to it. I read a lot of fantasy sci-fi, because there's a lot of books that are fantasy sci-fis. I read a lot of fantasy sci-fis. It feels like. I read a lot of middle grade fantasy. I read a lot of Rick Riordan. Obviously, I love a good middle grade fantasy. Yeah. I'm only just now getting into adult fantasy. I've been reading quite a bit of young adult fantasy. I've started reading Brandon Sanderson, Brandy Sandy, and Brandy Sandy We Trust as well. But also, I had just bought The Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobbs, so I hope to finally step foot into more adult fantasy. I've also read N.K. Jemisin, the fifth season, but I feel like I read a lot of what's technically classified as fantasy sci-fi. I want to read, like, more mysteries with fantasy aspects to it. I love a good mystery. Listen, I do. Okay. Who is one of your Autobio fantasy authors? Obviously, Rick Riordan. I will auto-buy anything Rick Riordan writes. Brandon Sanderson is also slowly becoming that, as I am working my way through the Cosmere. I literally pre-ordered Cytonic a year ago. I know that's not fantasy, but, like, Brandon Sanderson is mainly a fantasy writer, so So Rick Riordan and Brandon Sanderson is slowly becoming that too. I need to get more diverse with my reading. I know, but there's a lot. Alright. Number 6. How do you typically find fantasy recommendations? Booktube. I generally find my recommendations through Booktube. I would not have found Brandon Sanderson. I would not have found Robin Hobb. I would not have found N.K. Jemisin. I would not have found this plethora of fantasy novels. I don't think I would have even really gotten into young adult and adult fantasy if I hadn't gotten into Booktube. I get almost all of my recommendations from Booktube, not gonna lie. Number 7, what is the upcoming fantasy release you're excited for? I'm excited for the Nico and Will Solo Angelo book that's coming out next year. I'm very excited that those my cute little Grumpy Cinnamon Roll and his boyfriend are getting a solo adventure. by themselves. I'm always excited to get more into the Percy Jackson universe. As you know, I'm very excited. He announced that not too long ago, and he's actually co-writing that one. So, very excited. And number 8, what is one misconception about fantasy you would like to lay to rest? I would like to lay to rest that fantasy is difficult to get into. There is fantasy for pretty much everybody, I feel like. If you're one that reads a lot of romance, you're probably going to like the fantasy romance. There's plenty of good fantasy romance writers out there, including like Sarah J. Maas, who I probably would never read, but I don't like fantasy romance. She's just not for me. It's not that she's a terrible writer or the books that are terrible, they're just not for me. I feel like there is fantasy out there that you can read, and also middle grade fantasies can be enjoyed by anybody. Also, I've mentioned this quite a few times. Rick Riordan, my main man, the Hero of Olympus series is not middle grade. It's not middle grade. It's young adult. It's very young adult, but it's young adult. Can we just get past this misconception that Rick Riordan only writes middle grade? Because Heroes of Olympus series is not middle grade. Not by a long shot. It reads like a middle grade in a sense, but it's not. It's not. But I feel like fantasy is a lot more accessible than a lot of people make it out to be. And you shouldn't just jump into like Brandon Sanderson or Robin Hobb if you haven't really gotten into this kind of very expansive fantasy kind of settings. You can start in with like Sarah J. Maas, or if you wanted to, you could start with middle grade. Dive into a world of middle grade, because they're meant to be easily accessible. And it's a lot more diverse than it seems to be. There are a lot of great diverse authors out there. N.K. Jemisin, Tara Maffei, Shelley Parker Chan is another one. She just wrote She Became the Sun. Chloe Gong, who wrote These Violent Delights, which seems like it might be a romance, but it actually has some fantasy aspects to it too. The fantasy genre is vast and expansive, and it's accessible to people who have not read fantasy before. Whew. Number 9, if someone had never read a fantasy before and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that come to mind as places to start, what would those recommendations be? I would recommend Percy Jackson, because that is an urban fantasy getting into regular high fantasy. I would recommend reading something like The Hunger Games, because I feel like Hunger Games is something very comfortable and something people know, because the movies. And then getting into like high fantasy, I don't know if I would necessarily start someone on like N.K. Jemisin's 5th season, because the 5th season is a lot, and it's written very different than what people are normally used to, so I wouldn't really recommend that. But finding a diverse author, I think something like These Violent Delights, which is a Romeo and Juliet retelling, I think that's something that people will recognize and will be able to follow fairly easily as the story goes on, because I feel like people know the story of Romeo and Juliet, not just Romeo and Juliet, but like West Side Story, I feel like is also in there. So I feel like people can follow that kind of story. So retellings really is the way to go, I think, when it comes to recommending, because it's stories that people already know. And then there's Hunger Games, which everybody feels like everybody knows what the Hunger Games is by now. Number 10 is the last question. It says, who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator you came across that you'd like to shout out? Ooh, I don't know. I'm going to find the first person who is a small booktuber, and I will shout them out, that has done a fantasy on my video, on my feed. Looking. Booked and Busy is fun. I love her. She's great. She's not small, though. She's not a small booktuber, but she's great. I just saw that she did this tag. That's what kind of inspired me to do this tag. No. You know what? I'll say Booked and Busy for right now. Because I really do enjoy. I subscribed to her after watching one of her live streams where she was doing reading sprints. And she's just so funny. Genuinely so funny. And after watching that live stream, I was like, I want more of this girl. And I subscribed to her. So I will leave links to her in the description box below, obviously. And I will leave links to my reading Harry Potter, because I read Harry Potter out of order because I wanted to eat pizza. And I guess the original romance tag that this kind of came through. But I thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Go be a good cabbage kitty. Do something good for somebody, even if it is for yourself. And I'll see you in my next video. I love you. Bye.